During World War II, the German Nazis developed an elaborate contraption that was used to code messages that was called the Enigma machine. Perhaps in history or in a movie, you learned about this device that was basically an apparatus that looks like a typewriter. And with it, the Germans were able to not only create encrypted messages, but also to decipher them with another Enigma machine. And until the Allies managed to get their hands on an actual working Enigma machine, these messages were practically impossible to decipher because we did not possess the variable decipher code key. And if you want to actually see this captured Enigma machine and learn its unique story, you can find it, where we found this one in the nation's capital at the Spy Museum, where you can learn a lot about the history of intelligence work, test your skills at being a real-life spy, and even play a movie spy like James Bond in some of those demonstrative exhibits. But I will let you uncover that secret for yourself. Yet, if you have been reading or watching the news since the release of the investigative report, there was a lot of concern among the members of Congress about being able to crack the code of redactions included in the over 400 pages contained in the report produced by Robert Mueller, a professional investigator who consumed 22 months to uncover the information contained in that report. And even now that they have obtained that document in unredacted form, they still have questions and are calling upon a professional investigator to come to them to explain the unredacted report so that they can spend yet more time playing investigators themselves because they are granted that power under the Constitution. And because, like Don Beyer, who came out as the first congressman in the Virginia delegation to demand impeachment because he believes, with no legal training, that that is the appropriate thing to do, regardless of whether the professional investigative report made that recommendation or not. So much for presumption of innocence or even fair trial, because for Don, if it looks a lot like what he believes is impeachable, then apparently that is sufficient. And taking that position, perhaps the NAACP should sit down with Don Beyer to ask him about his true feelings on the alleged shootings of unarmed black men who apparently look like they too were doing something wrong. So for now, let's forget about Don and dig right into document exploitation analysis, as the professionals describe it. Examine this unredacted document closely, very closely. It is a job offer to a person for a high-paying job. The reasonable assumption is that the individual is qualified for that job if you know nothing else about this document. But if you were permitted to inquire in the open source about some facts in this document, you might learn that at this particular time in history, the recipient of this lucrative procurement job just happened to be a candidate for U.S. Congress. Incidentally, also running against our friend Don Beyer, and described in the press as both the putative frontrunner for the Republican nomination and the loudest voice in opposition to him. This fact in the National Capital Region should raise an eyebrow because most are familiar with the Hatch Act, a prohibited activity under the Civil Service Reform Act. And it is obvious that a federal employee with a lucrative procurement job or without is prohibited from seeking a party nomination or running for office. So, if the candidate accepted that federal job in exchange for withdrawing as the putative frontrunner and loudest voice in opposition to Don Beyer under federal criminal law, found at 18 U.S.C. 201, paragraph C, it also constitutes an illegal gratuity, which is a misdemeanor punishable by fine and or imprisonment up to 2 years. If there is a quid pro quo that can be established, that misdemeanor, punishable by 2 years, suddenly grows to a bribe. under 18 U.S.C. 201 paragraph B, which is punishable by up to 15 years in prison. So, by simply looking at the words contained within the four corners of this document, and informed by background information available to everyone in the open source environment, we have just determined, with very little analysis, that a federal job applicant has been presented with a situation that involves not only a transaction that creates tension between acceptance of a government personnel action that will result in avoidance of a prohibited activity, but also a government action that potentially creates an illegal gratuity or bribe that is punishable as a misdemeanor in the first case or a felony in the second. Perhaps the government did not know that the job applicant was a candidate for political office, and it was in fact not a personnel action that was intended to create this situation. That is possible, but also maybe not. To determine if this government action had a malicious intent, we would, or unlawful purpose, we would have to learn more from the author of this document, or we would have to learn more about the recipient of this document. And in this situation, the federal job offer was to whom the job was the recipient of the federal job offer was privy to knowledge that we might not be able to easily collect in the open source. He knew that he was not qualified for the job that was offered to him, and that acceptance would create an unjust enrichment for him, potentially depriving a fully qualified applicant from taking that job. And that additional fact raises the question as to why the recipient was aware of that, based upon the application that he had submitted for this federal employment decision. He should not have been offered this job. Why didn't the agency that offered the job also recognize that he was not qualified for the job? And that inquiry transforms this piece of paper into a pretty definite illegal gratuity, because the offerer had to know, or should have known, that the applicant was unqualified. And it also makes this action a prohibited activity performed by the person who extended this job offer. At the town hall hosted by Don Beyer on July 8, 2019, he agreed that these facts raised some concerns. And he also stated to a crowd of at least 100 of his supporters that this was the first time that he had ever heard about this transaction. But for some reason, Don was less than forthcoming, because he was, in fact, fully aware of this transaction, because he and his office had been contacted by that federal job applicant to assist him in obtaining more information from the federal agency under the Freedom of Information Act. And Don and his office acknowledged receipt of this request, but to date has failed to follow up with a response either agreeing or refusing to assist in gathering evidence to support a finding of culpability for a federal employee who had perpetrated a prohibited activity in the merit-based civil service system that was created by the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978, but which also created criminal conduct that was punishable under law as a gratuity, regardless of whether it was willful or negligent, or potentially a bribe. And Tim Kaine, for whatever reason, has also failed to assist the federal job applicant in obtaining information to support a finding of culpability by a federal employee who at least failed to determine the eligibility of a job applicant who had been offered a federal job. And so, just this one document is a smoking gun that is deeply distressing, because it affects the reputation and integrity of both our fair and free elections, as well as our merit-based civil service system, about which apparently both Don and Tim did not care enough to assist in resolving, even though an adverse determination would have potentially incriminated them. Fortunately, however, Mark Warner was gracious enough to intervene to assist in expediting the response from the federal agency that had at first expressed some reluctance also to cooperate and provide a reply. And that request for information under the Freedom of Information Act produced the second document of our document exploitation analysis, which we see displayed here. This document is a typical response from a federal agency under the Freedom of Information Act, redacted in part, but also providing specific codes that reference the Freedom of Information Act exemptions that apply to justify non-disclosure of that particular piece of information. So, unlike the first document that we examined that simply blacked out certain parts of the document like we used to do in FOIA, leaving us in the dark as to why that information was hidden from view, under the current practices of our federal government, we now provide requesters with a cheat sheet to determine exactly why information was not released, but which also provides the recipient with a way to form a reasonable hypothesis as to what the government is attempting to shield from disclosure. Most analysts believe that this is not a good idea in the intelligence field because it creates an opportunity for a skilled intelligence analyst on the other side to crack our Enigma code and decipher the information that we had gone through the deliberate effort to conceal with a redaction, obscuring that information from working at cross purposes with our sensitive government information. Essentially, we are employing federal employees to cover up information and then leave a little note to tell you what they covered up. But what does this document tell us without those codes? We have what appears to be a decision-making document. At the very beginning, we are informed that someone was offered a job that he or she decided not to accept because of an opportunity somewhere else. Good for him. And we are told that one named person is one of two remaining candidates for the position, and that our congressional candidate is next in succession to be offered the job. Is that perfectly clear from just reading the introduction to this document, which we call a deliberative process document, which is under most circumstances undisclosable under the exemptions to the Freedom of Information Act, under 5 U.S.C. 552 paragraph B, subparagraph 5, or what we call a FOIA exemption 5, or simply B5. So, it is at least interesting that we even have this document, not classified at the time, in our possession. And it may be indicative of the fact that this agency is very aware that something inappropriate had indeed occurred. And they are indicating their willingness to cooperate with the investigation, unlike Don Beyer and Tim Kaine, who decided to try to avoid the matter altogether, as they are continuing to do, even though it most directly affects the conduct of their campaigns during the 2016 elections, in which Hillary Clinton won Virginia by only 5 points, but lost the election and denied Tim Kaine the vice presidency and Don Beyer, his heir apparent, an opportunity to ascend to the Senate. That sounds a lot like a motive. Motive means opportunity. This we gather just by reading the redacted letter, without any knowledge about what is hidden under these mysterious codes. But this letter tells us even more, even in redacted form. This letter informs us that the agency requirement has expired, and there is no longer a need to fill this position. So, why is anyone in a government agency asking for permission to still extend a job offer for a position that is no longer required, right? Doesn't that sound like government waste, fraud, and abuse? But also, in addition to this odd question, they are asking yet another odd question to their higher headquarters as to whether or not they should extend that job offer to this congressional candidate. Does that ring any alarm bells? It should, because both questions should never arise, especially if you have a qualified candidate and no requirement to hire him. Moot as law, as we say in court. Now, does anyone need to use the ladies' room? Let's go on. Let's look for a moment at the codes to see if we can decipher what else is on this undisclosable deliberative process document. Do you see the B6 code to explain the reason why the other applicant for the job has his name removed? That is a FOIA Exemption 6, and that means that he is just some ordinary person, ordinary Joe Metro, who is entitled to some privacy, just like you. But all of the others have a B3 code to explain the redaction decision, with a particular federal statute after the code. A FOIA Exemption 3 is reserved for that information that the government cannot disclose because there is some controlling statute that dictates that that information is very sensitive and cannot be released. Cannot. And the reference statute is 10 U.S.C. 424, which pertains to certain national intelligence agencies. If you're familiar with Executive Order 12498, signed by President Bill Clinton in 1995, we pretty much have those individuals that can classify documents, like the Secretary of State. And within the intelligence community, you're going to pretty much find these agencies falling under those persons. Well, isn't that interesting for anyone to learn? It is like running around with a business card that says spy and handing it out to everyone that you meet. Whatever happened to saying, I am not KGB? Well, thank Barack Obama for that, if you are not already bubbling over his legacy in the Iran nuclear deal, with which we are currently contending in the Middle East. So the Enigma decoding machine that good old Barack Hussein Obama hand-delivered to us now can be used to determine that the author, the recipient, and the person who was offered the job are somehow connected to these select intelligence activities. And we see that one of these, let's just say spies, decided not to take this job, but go to another, spy job. Good for him. And our unqualified congressional candidate and some other lucky person running around in America are being considered for recruitment into this James Bond spy job. Good for them, right? Why am I not getting a warm and fuzzy feeling about this? But attorneys for the Merit Systems Protections Board, however, say that the congressional candidate should have been pleased as punch, as they are most upset that he decided to make a big fuss and get into litigation about the matter, for whatever reason. So, who exactly are the spook types who decided to extend an offer of a job to an unqualified job applicant and candidate for U.S. Congress who just happened to be the putative frontrunner for the Republican nomination and Don Beyer's most vocal opponent? Wouldn't it be great to learn that information? Well, thank Barack Obama again for this magic trick, because his wonderful gift to us is virtually like an autographed letter that we can keep as a memento and hope that one day it will be worth something. Recall that this was a job offer from a procurement analyst. And in the military, as well as in the government, those functions are separated into functional areas. So we know that the person who hit the send button on this email was the senior procurement person for that government spook agency, or someone with authority to speak for him. Because only he would know about both the procurement position as well as whether or not the mission requirement had expired or not. Can we send in the drones? And if I am the senior procurement person at this agency discussing a national security requirement, remember that list in Executive Order 12498, 498 discussing a national security requirement that has expired. Who could I contact to determine if I can still offer a job to any applicant, qualified or not, congressional candidate or not, to get authority to perform this particular transaction? It's a call to the higher headquarters. Why, of course, use your noggin. And in this case, as a job for the Defense Intelligence Agency, the only higher headquarters with authority to make that decision is the senior procurement person in the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence at the Pentagon, working under the Secretary of Defense for then President Barack Obama. And we know that Barack Obama would never, ever, ever do anything illegal to help his former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to do anything like win an election, especially by gross negligence with national security information, right? Good. I'm satisfied. Well, maybe if you are getting excited about Don and impeachment of the president, this means nothing to you. Or you are ready to deflect and scream something like crazy and porn tabs. But I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. An oath I took freely without mental reservation or purpose of evasion. So next week, let me tell you what I intend to do. I intend to subpoena these individuals in litigation with the Merit Systems Protections Board that they are now even still trying to quash. And the American people can get real answers then that for some reason Tim Kaine and Don Beyer are not exactly helping for the American people to have. I cannot speak directly to their personal motivations, but it does not look good. And I will make the further recommendation for immediate effect to close that door that Barack Obama left open for our enemies to threaten the sensitive government information that is presented by providing these deciphering codes. And so in November, it is a referendum election where you have the power to choose between the party of manumission, slavery, oppression, Jim Crow, and subjugation, or to choose the party of emancipation. In November, you have the power to choose between the party of welfare entitlement and government dependency, or the party of opportunity. In November, you have the power to choose between the party of underperforming public schools and achievement gaps, or the party of school choice. You have the power to choose between the party of mandatory union membership or the party of a right to work. You have the power to choose between the party of universal socialized medicine or the party that will let you choose your provider and your doctor and your insurance plan. In November, you have the power to choose between the party of awaiting the arrival of law enforcement or the party of the right to stand your ground and defend yourself. In November, you have the power to choose between the party of higher taxes and growing bureaucracies or the power of lower taxes and self-determination. It is your party and it is your choice. I am a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican, in that order. And I am not ashamed of the gospel. My name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for U.S. Congress, not unmindful of the future, with liberty and excellence. Let's make America great again. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.